This is a special presentation brought to you by the Daf Map, based on one of the lectures given by HaRav Yehonasan Berger Shlita. Please check out our other videos and shiurim at www.thedafmap.com.
Before we begin today's shiur, which will begin on Nun Vav Omid Beis, 19 lines from the top at a Mishnah in the middle of the page, let us note that the shiur up till this point concerning Daf Nun Vav was recorded as part of our shiur for Daf Nun Hey. So that if you, for some reason, want to begin Daf Nun Vav as a Daf Yomi purist, you will find Daf Nun Vav Omid Aleph begins at the 29-minute, 5-second mark of our shiur for Daf Nun Hey. So, we begin today's shiur, however, Nun Vav Omid Beis, almost in the middle of the page at the Mishnah. Before we begin the Mishnah, we glance at the side of our Daf Gemara on Nun Vav Omid Beis. We have a nosei, a topic heading, and it reads, Machloikas Tanoim, Be'ezed Tuma Min HaMeis, Mechayev Al Bias Mikdash. There is a prohibition of entering the Beis HaMikdash in a state of defilement. Certainly, one who is defiled to the dead, he would be prohibited in entering the Beis HaMikdash. With that brief background in mind, we now turn to the Mishnah. Omar Rabbi Eliezer, Mishum Rabbi Yoshua. The Gemara will be focusing primarily on the issue of the names, so that the issue of defilement and Beis HaMikdash entrance is not really the main thrust, the main interest of this particular sugya, but we'll discuss it all the same. So, Rabbi Ozer quotes Rabbi Yeshua. When you see the name Rabbi Yeshua without any additional names, namely the son of so-and-so, Stam Rabbi Yeshua is Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya. So Rabbi Ozer quotes Rabbi Yeshua saying, Kol tuma min hameis, Nazir megaleach olea, chayovin olea al bias mikdash. Any kind of tumas meis that would force a Nazir to stop his Nazirus and lose the days that he counted toward his Nazirus, culminating with a haircut that is known as a tiglachas tumah, and then would have to resume, of course, his Nazirus from the beginning. That kind of tumas meis, and we've discussed this already at great length. Remember, the Mishnah on Daf Mem Tes listed all of those situations of tumas meis that cause the Nazir to lose his previous counted Nazirus days because of this defilement. So if it's that level of tumas meis that causes a Nazir ligaleach, entering the Beis HaMikdash in that state, anyone who enters the Beis HaMikdash having come into contact with that kind of tumas meis will then be guilty of the prohibition of entering the Beis HaMikdash in a state of defilement. V'chol tuma min hameis she'ein ha-Nazir megaleach aleha. The examples we saw in the Mishnah on Daf Nun Dalid, those kinds of death defilement that don't cause a Nazir to lose his previously counted Nazirus days, ein chayovin olea al bias mikdash. So then one will not be in violation of entering the Beis HaMikdash, which if one does so he would not be said to be chayev. Chayev meaning guilty of that offense. Omar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir disagrees with this approach, and he says, Lo tezu kalo min hasheretz. The case of tumas meis, even if a Nazir wouldn't have to megaleach, wouldn't lose his Nazirus days, nevertheless shouldn't be viewed as any less than someone who is defiled because of having touched a dead sheretz. Dead sheretz. Sheretz is a type of one of 8 different creepy crawler organisms that the Torah prohibits touching and becoming defiled and then entering the Beis Hamikdash. It's not prohibited to touch them when they're dead, but if one touches them when they're dead and enters the Beis Hamikdash, he certainly then is in violation. So, for Tumas Sheretz, which doesn't have the purification process that Tumas Meis does have, and yet one is chayav for entering the Beis Hamikdash, so all the more so if someone is Tomei Meis, which has greater stringencies. It has the third and seventh day water, ash, pure mixture sprinkled on the individual for purification. Certainly that kind of bias mikdash would be guilty, says Rabbi Meir, even if a Nazir would not lose his Nazirus as a result. Now, as we said, the Gemara isn't going to focus so much on this issue of defilement upon entrance to the Beis Hamikdash, or violation of entering the Beis Hamikdash in a state of defilement. We have a long question, and the question concerns: who did Rabbi Eliezer really receive this tradition from? As you can see, we have a long question marking, and in this long question, a source appears, and we have some dashed underlining in the source, the latter part of the source. So skip ahead, and you'll see a line that says, Kachamar li Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol mishum Rabbi Yeshua. Here you have Rabbi Eliezer is saying that I heard from Rabbi Yeshua bar Memel, who himself had heard it from Rabbi Yeshua, this rule that we saw in the Mishnah. So if Rabbi Eliezer heard it directly from Rabbi Yeshua bar Memel, so why does our Mishnah say that Rabbi Eliezer received it from Rabbi Yeshua, who we said is Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya? It's someone else. So our question then is, based on the information that we're going to see in this Brisa source, it's not a Mishnah, it's a Tanaic source, but it's not a Mishnah. Based on what we see in this Brisa, why does the Mishnah speak the way it does? Namely, that Rabbi Eliezer received this Tumah information from Rabbi Yeshua, when in reality Rabbi Eliezer received it from Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol, someone else, who in turn had received it from Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, so we have a sugya that deals with the issue of transmission. Parenthetically, you might ask, why is this so important? So, I can tell you in general, on a philosophical level, Judaism is very, very rooted in this concept of transmission, of we call Mesorah, how halacha was given. And when we learn Torah, we essentially are learning content that originated at Mount Sinai from the Almighty Himself, transmitting information, transmitting the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu to Yehoshua. Interesting, the name Yehoshua appears again over here, but that's Yehoshua ben Nun, who transmitted to Kolev and the sages, the elders of the time, and then after that to the prophets, etc. We'll see a little bit of that later in our sugya. But transmission and Mesorah is very significant in Judaism, in Torah study, and hence a piece of Gemara that's dedicated to the issue of names and transmission has a great deal of symbolism and significance. So now the Gemara. We begin with this long question. For Rabbi Eliezer Mishum Rabbi Yeshua Gomar Law, is it so that Rabbi Eliezer learned these rules of Tumah and Beis Hamikdash from Rabbi Yeshua? And Rabbi Yeshua, we said, is Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya. V'ha Mishum Rabbi Yeshua ben Bar Momol Gomar Law. Rabbi Eliezer really heard this from Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol. Tisanya Omar Rabbi Eliezer Kisholachti L'Ardaskya. That's the name of a place. When I went there, Motzasi es Rabbi Yeshua ben Peterosh, another Rabbi Yeshua, very interesting. It's a little bit beyond coincidence, I think, that there are a lot of these Rabbi Yeshua names appearing in the sugya. So he says, I met him. His name is Rabbi Yeshua ben Peterosh. Shahoya Yoshe V'Don Lifnei Rabbi Meir Bahalocha. And this Rabbi Shua ben Peterosh was seated in front of Rabbi Meir and saying the following halacha. Kol tumo min hamei shanozir megaleach oleo chayov emoleo mishum bias mikdash. V'chol tumo min hamei she'ein hanozir megaleach oleo ein chayov emoleo mishum bias mikdash. The same information we saw and explained in the Mishnah. Omar lo, and Rabbi Meir, I'm sure you're not going to be surprised to hear what he says in this brisa. It's what he said in the Mishnah. He says, Al tezu kalo misheretz. Don't let tumas meis, even if a Nazir is not migaleach oleo, even if he doesn't lose out his previously counted Nazir's days, do not let it be lighter than tumas sheretz. Tumas sheretz is a lesser form of tumah than tumas meis. It's basically a one-day tumah. There's no zrikas poraduma water ash mixture, and yet one who enters the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumas sheretz, having had contact with a dead creature, he will be guilty. Amarti lo klum ato boki Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol. So Rabbi Eliezer asked Rabbi Meir, do you know Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol? Omar li hein, and he says, yes, I know him. Well, Rabbi Eliezer says, Kach Omar li Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol, Mishum Rabbi Yeshua. Kol tuma, and again the same halacha is repeated. Kol tuma min hamesha nozir megalech oleo chayav oleo mishum bias mikdash. V'chol tuma min hamesha ein hanozir megalech oleo ein chayovim oleo mishum bias mikdash. Have mishum Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol gomir lo. Well, you see here very clearly that Rabbi Eliezer received this information from Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol. Why then in the Mishnah, which was authored or edited by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the Mishnah record Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol? Amru, so they answered as follows. Shma mino, we learn from this. We learn from the way that Rebbe presented the Mishnah with the names. Kol Shmaitza de Misamro bebeit Tlosa. Shmaitza are halachas, laws that are taught through a chain of names. In this case, we have a chain. We have Rabbi Yeshua teaching Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol, who taught Rabbi Eliezer. So when you have a chain like this, Kadmoy Basroy Amrinon, the first and last names we will say, Mitzioi Lo Amrinon. The middle one, we're not obligated to cite. It's true in the Brisa you see that, but you don't have to do that. There is an obligation. In fact, the Gemara mentions elsewhere that when you say a halacha and you say it in the name of its author, of the one from whom you received it, you are meritorious of bringing redemption to the world. You're maybe gula li'olam. So there is importance in citing the names from where you learned what you learned. When you have a chain of names, so you are to cite the original name and the last name before the from whom, i.e., the one from whom you received it. The middle name is not required, and therefore Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, who taught it Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol, who in turn taught it to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua bar Momol does not need to be mentioned, and hence Rebbe in the Mishnah doesn't mention his name. Omar of Nahri, Tzok Af Ana Nami Tanina. We have a Mishnaic source that supports this. Omar Nochum HaLavlor. Lavlor, technically speaking, is a scribe. It's part of his name. Nochum HaLavlor says, Kach Mekublani Mi Rabbi Meisha Shekibel Mei Abo Shekibel Min Hazugos Shekiblu Min Avim Halocha Lamoshe Misinai. The following is a halacha that was received ultimately from Moshe Rabbeinu, who had received it from Mount Sinai. The following halacha: B'zeireya sheves v'charol b'shnayim u'shloshim mekomos. I want to point out that when you look in the commentaries, they change the girsa over here to different plants, but for our purposes, we're not really focusing on the halachas of peah, which is one of the tithes that one leaves for the poor from one's field. Nevertheless, I just want you to be aware that there are other versions of this particular source, and it says that if one plants sheves and chardal, these are different kinds of plants, b'shnayim u'shloshin makomos, in 2 or 3 different parts of his field, shenoising peah mikol echad v'echad, from each plot he has to leave the peah tithe. Now we see a halacha with a chain of names. V'ilu Yehoshua v'kolev lo kachoshiv. It mentions that Moshe Rabbeinu received a halacha, and he transmitted it to the prophets, who in turn transmitted it to the zugos. Zugos, you can see in the Rashi, they are, zugos literally means pairs. They are the leading Jewish figures through the what's called the early Tanaic period, who in turn transmitted it to Abba, who taught it to Rabbi Mesha. In this list of names, you don't see Yoshua, who had received it from Moshe Rabbeinu, and Yoshua transmitted it to Kolev, or possibly Yoshua and Kolev were together, but you don't see them mentioned. You see Moshe Rabbeinu, and then the Nevi'im. Rashi points out that all of the names, starting with the Nevi'im, or references to people from the Nevi'im, down through the Zugos and Abba, and these are all people that lived during the Second Temple period, and they're all considered one name entity. If we look in the Rashi, V'ilu Yoshua v'Kolev Dahavu Mitzoi, they are in the middle, Lo Kachoshiv, they are not even mentioned. Alma Dekamoi Ubasroi Amrino Mitzoi Lo Amrino. From here we see the first name, which is Moshe Rabbeinu, and Basroi, the last unit of names, is considered one name for our purposes. They are mentioned, Mitzoi Lo Amrinon. The middle are not mentioned. And Rashi points out, Min hanavim ve'elech kachoshiv kul kechada mipnei shahoyu mibayas sheni ve'elech. They're considered one name entity because they were all part of historically speaking, from the Second Temple period onwards. So we see here proof to what the Gemara had answered, that when you have a chain of names, the first name and the last name are important. The middle name does not need to be cited. And as the Gemara says, Be'ilu Yoshuva Kolev Lo Kachoshiv Shma Mino. So this proves what we said. Now the Mishnah. Omar Rabbi Akiva. Danti Lifnei Rabbi Eliezer. I analyzed, or I stated in front of Rabbi Eliezer, Ma'im etzem kisa'ora she'eno metama oda ba'oil ha-Nazir megaleach al mago v'al maso, a bone from a corpse, the size of the bone being the size of a barley grain. If a person and the bone are in the same room, there is no tumah communicated from the bone to the person. That would be oyel. Oyel meaning in the same overshadow, the ceiling, or it could be under the same tree branch, or whatever, but it's an overshadowing. Bones that small, in other words, a bone the size of a barley grain, would not communicate tumah. A bone does communicate tumah, tumas meis, if it's that size, through maga or masa, contact or carrying. So an etzem kisora is, we'll say, not that defiling, and yet a Nazir who touches a bone from a corpse the size of a barley grain loses whatever Nazirus days he had counted till that point of contact. So we're going to make a kal v'chomer now, starting with the etzem kisora, which we will call a light level of tumah, and yet the Nazir loses his previous counted days because of contact with it. Revias dam shehu mitama odam b'oil, a quarter lug of blood from a corpse. that does transmit Tumah through Ohel, HaNazir Megaleach al Mago v'al Maso. Let me read that again. Revias dam shu metame odem boil eino din shei HaNazir Megaleach al Mago v'al Maso. A Revias dam which is, let's say, more defiling in that sense that it communicates Tumah through Ohel, certainly a Nazir should lose his previous counted days. And yet, there are those like Rabbi Eliezer who says that's not so. In fact, we saw in our previous Mishnah on Daf Nun Dalid, I say previous Mishnah and earlier Mishnah, that a Revias Dam does not cause a Nazir to lose his counted days. It's true that a Revias Dam creates defilement through Ohel, but a Nazir does not lose out. So Omar Li, Rabbi Akiva tells us that Rabbi Eliezer answered me, Ma ze Akiva, ein donin kan mikal v'chomer. In this particular area, we do not apply kal v'chomer logic. The Gemara will explain what he means when he says over here we don't apply that. But in this area, we're not going to apply it. And Rabbi Akiva continues telling us the story that when I told these matters over to Rabbi Yeshua, Amar Yofe Almarta Ela Kain Omru Halacha. You are saying something that logically makes sense, but nevertheless, we can't come to your conclusion because this is the way the oral tradition has been stated. Namely, that the bone size of barley grain causes Nazir to lose out. Revias Dam, in the same Ohel as the Nazir, will not cause him to lose his previous counted days. The Gemara continues at the top of Daf Nun Zayin, Ibayalaho. Here the Gemara raises a question with two possibilities, and we have them noted as Aleph and Beis. We just learned in the Mishnah that we're dealing with an area of halacha that is called halacha l'Moshe Sinai, an oral tradition, an oral communication passed down from the giving of the Torah at Sinai. And since we're dealing with that kind of halacha, so kal v'chomer is not used, kal v'chomer logic is not applied. What's not clear, though, is, and we feature this on the side under our noseh, our topic heading. Let's read it together. Mahu ha'alocha l'Moshe Sinai shemuzkar b'Mishnah. Which point is associated with an oral tradition? We say an oral tradition, we mean it's not something that's based on a pasuk per se. Which aspect of what we've said is the halacha l'Moshe Sinai? Aleph, the Nazir megaleach al etzem kisora. That point, that a Nazir loses the counted days that he has observed toward his Nazirus upon contact with a bone from a corpse the size of a barley grain. That idea that the Nazir loses out because of etzem kisora, maybe that's the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Oi, possibility base. The Revias Dam metame boihel, that a quantity of blood, the Revias Dam, that it transmits tumas meis through ohel, that's the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Okay, so now that having been said, the Gemara raises this. Let's look at it in the text. Ibayalaho etzem kisaora halacha u'Revias Dam kal v'chomer. Is it so that bone size of barley grain, forcing a Nazir to lose his previous counted days, is the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and we wanted to use that as a springboard to draw conclusions, to reach conclusions regarding the Revias Dam. And to that we said, v'ein donin kal v'chomer mehalacha. We don't use kal v'chomer logic when its point of origin was halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Oy dilma, or possibly Revias Dam halacha. the idea that a Revi'as Dam communicates Tumah through Ohel, that is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Rashi elaborates a bit on this. There is a pasuk that makes reference to Tumah communicated through blood from a corpse. However, when you read the pasuk itself, it would seem that you would need blood from two corpses. So the idea that blood from one corpse would communicate Tumas Ohel, that's not really purely pasuk based. So it would be called halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So the idea that Revi'as Dam communicates, Revi'as Dam again is a measure, it's a liquid measure of blood from a corpse. Its ability to communicate Tumas Meis through Ohel, that maybe is the halacha l'Moshe Misinai. The etzem kisa'ora kal v'chomer, and what that means, it'd be very, very tricky over here. It means we would then apply kal v'chomer logic from etzem kisa'ora and learn from etzem kisa'ora to Revi'as Dam through kal v'chomer that the Nazir would have to migaleach over his being in the same room with a Revi'as Dam. So let's read that again. O Dilma Revi'as Dam halacha, the etzem kisa'ora kal v'chomer, the ein donin kal v'chomer mei halacha. And in order to conclude the law of Nazir Megaleach on the Revi'as Dam, that would have been through kal v'chomer logic, starting with the etzem kisora. But once again, there is a difference in these two versions. In version Aleph, the halacha l'Moshe Misinai is telling us that the etzem kisora forces the Nazir to take the haircut. In version B, the halacha l'Moshe Misinai is telling us that a Revi'as Dam communicates Tumah through Ohel. In both cases, it is true that we're trying to conclude through kal v'chomer that Revi'as Dam would force a Nazir legaleach aleha. But which point specifically is the halacha l'Moshe Misinai? Tashma. So we answer, and this is a Tanaic source, and you'll see that it matches version Aleph, the first version. It says, etzem kisora halacha. The idea that an etzem kisora, bone the size of a barley grain, forces a Nazir to take his haircut, that is the halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Urevi'as Dam kal v'chomer, and the idea that the Revi'as Dam will force, or would force a Nazir, in theory, to take the haircut would be something derived through kal v'chomer logic. However, the ain't done in kal v'chomer mehalacha. But we don't use kal v'chomer reasoning when it is starting off with or based on a point of information that was halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And in this case, it's very clear, it's very simple, that etzem kisora, forcing a Nazir to take a haircut, was the halacha l'Moshe Misinai, and we tried to say if for that a Nazir would have to take would lose his previously counted days, then all the more so for a Revi'as Dam. But as we said, that logic is not acceptable when you're dealing with halachas that are whose origin is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. As you can see, with this we've reached the end of the 7th parak of Maseches Nazir. Mirza Hashem, in our next shiur, we'll begin the 8th parak. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.
This was a presentation of the Daf Map. We hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to be informed of our other videos. For resources and more information, please visit our website at www.thedafmap.com.